Shalom uvracha miYerushalayim Ir HaKodesh. This evening we are privileged to study the Haftarah of Parshat Bechukotai, which also serves as the Haftarah of the joint readings of Behar and Bechukotai. This particular year, for instance, outside of Eretz Yisrael, they are reading this Shabbat Behar-Bechukotai. In Eretz Yisrael, we are reading Bechukotai, but the Haftarah is the same in both communities. We're studying sections of the 16th and 17th chapters of the book of Yirmiyahu, the book of Jeremiah. And in the Torah section of Bechukotai, there are discussions about various forms of behavior which will bring about various levels of blessing, and various forms of behavior which will bring about the opposite of blessing. An entire section in Bechukotai dealing with that. In the Haftarah, we also have a reference to a contrast between two attitudes or two types of behavior. And I quote, if you're following in the text, I'm reading from chapter 17 of Yirmiyahu. I'm going to start with sentence 7 and then go back to sentence 5. In the words of Yirmiyahu, words which are very familiar to us from our daily prayers in many communities, the daily liturgical order in many communities, it's included in the Birchat HaMazon, very famous pasuk, probably the most famous pasuk of our Haftarah. Baruch HaGever Asher Yiftach Ba'Adonai V'Haya Adonai Miftacho. Blessed is the individual who puts his or her trust in God. There's an emphasis in our Haftarah of putting one's trust in God, of turning to God. V'haya Hashem Miftacho can mean that God is really their source of trust, or perhaps when they put their trust in God, then God responds by being there to be ever so present for them, since they relied upon God. But I would like to suggest that there may be an error, or perhaps a misconception of what it means to trust in God. Because earlier in the Haftarah, and this verse is sometimes quoted by people who want to speak about trusting in God, we learn in sentence 5 of the same chapter, chapter 17, verse 5, Ko amar Hashem, Arur HaGever Asher Yiftach Ba'adam. Cursed is the individual who trusts in people, puts their trust in people. And I've heard, over the years, people quote these sentences as saying, you see, you have to stay away from people. You can only rely, no, seriously, right? You can only rely upon God. It says here, cursed is the person who trusts in people. Does that mean that you cannot ask people for favors? Does that mean you can't call up people to assist you? Does it mean that you can't discuss certain issues with people? I would like to say that I don't think that's what's being said here. Because if you carefully read sentence 5, where it speaks about putting trust in people, it says there, Arura Gever Asher Yiftach Ba'adam V'Sam Basar Zra'o, and his whole strength is in human beings. Umin Hashem Yasur Libo. I believe that the only time it's problematic to put any kind of weight of any kind of decision or any kind of assistance in the hands of a human being is if that person plays a role where you cut God out completely from that activity. In other words, where the person replaces God, where you were trusting in that person exclusively, that is a problem. But if someone, I don't know, needs a source of employment, they need a job, and they call up someone they know who has an employment agency, that's not called trusting in a person, as long as they understand that God is the one who's going to ultimately help them find the proper form of employment. If someone is in need of trying to find a spouse, they're desperately interested in getting married to the right person, and they call up someone and they ask them to help them. That's not called trusting in a person. It's only trusting in a person that's problematic when God is out of the equation. And I'd like to cite two examples of this from Tanakh, and I think in both cases the point is very, very strongly emphasized. I think one of the most famous examples of someone who seemingly was punished because they put their trust in a person is a very famous biblical character, one of the most outstandingly righteous individuals in the Torah, in the book of Bereshit. His name is Yosef. Anybody remember in which context he puts his trust in someone? Anybody remember?
When he's in prison, he asks the
Sarah Mashkim, right? Yes, that's right.
To mention him to
He asks the chief butler, okay, listen, you're getting out of jail in 3 days. In 3 days, Paro will review your case, and you will be restored to your original position. Could you mention my name to Pharaoh? Could you get me out of this? Could you get me out of this jail? And the rabbis say, Yosef, you're relying upon the Sarah Mashkim. You're relying upon the chief butler, and he mikates shenatayim yamin. Yosef stays in jail for 2 extra years.
Because of that.
But because of that, that's what the last.
Right.
Rashi quotes it from the Midrash in his last comment in Parshat Vayeshev. For those people interested, it says that mipnei shetalabo Yosef bitchono, because Joseph put his trust in this butler who's kak lihiyot asur shnei shanim, and it always bothered me. It always bothered me ever since I began to study this. You mean you can't ask someone for a favor? So let's say, God forbid, it should never happen to anyone. Someone is in prison based on false pretenses. What is he doing in jail? The whole thing is a setup, and you have someone in a governmental office who can assist you. You're not allowed to ask them to help you. Is that what we learned from the story of Yosef? And I've heard people repeat that. I would like to say that maybe the mistake is not that he asks the Sarah Mashkim, but rather that he doesn't mention God at all. I'll read the sentence that Yosef says to the butler, to the chief butler. Ki im zachartani ittecha. I want you to remember me together with you when things go well for you. Kasher yitav ve'asita na imadichas, and you shall do with me kindness. No mention of God. V'hizkartani el paro, and you shall mention my name to Pharaoh. V'hotzeitani. And you shall get me out of this place. I guess today, if we would be speaking, and of course, who am I to criticize Yosef's form of speech? But if you want to say that this is what the rabbis meant, I think what they meant is there's no mention here about with the help of God or with God's assistance or with God's blessing. Today, I think we would all say, or we would want to say, Bezrat Hashem or B'siata D'Shemaya, some reference to God. It's not merely that he asks the Sar HaMashkim. I don't think there's a sin to ask Sar HaMashkim. I don't think there's a sin to ask people who can help you. Could you carry out a favor for me? I think that maybe when you remove God, as it says in Yirmiyahu here, Umin Hashem Yasorli, but there's no mention of God. Yosef is the one who's constantly talking about Elokim, right? And that's what he says to Paro. When Paro calls him into the palace, he says, well, Biladai, Elokim, remember that? It's not me, Elokim Ya'aneh Shlom Paro. So perhaps, if they are criticizing Yosef, then the criticism is not just asking someone for a favor. Maybe asking someone for a favor is not a violation of trusting in God. It's only when you believe that person exclusively, individually, without the blessing of God, can carry something out. If God forbid someone is not feeling well, everyone should always feel perfectly healthy. Let's say someone doesn't feel well and they go to a physician. It's not that they're putting that. So maybe there are 2 different ways to go to a doctor. Maybe there's a way of going to the doctor and thinking that the doctor is the all-powerful healer, and maybe that's a problem because then you've removed your trust from God. But if you realize that people are messengers of God, or you employ the name of God, the prayer to God, and that what you're doing, then that's not prohibited. Maybe that's even the proper form of behavior. The second example I'd like to cite is from the end of the Tanakh, from the last book of the Bible, from the book of Divrei Hayamim. Now, in Divrei Hayamim, that's the very end of it's the last book that we have in the Tanakh, of the last book of the 24 books, and there's a discussion there of a man named Asa, Aleph Samach Aleph. one of the very, very pious kings. Example of the same phenomenon can be found in the last of the books of the Tanakh, in Chronicles 2, in Divrei Hayamim Bet. That's, Divrei Hayamim is the 24th of the 24 books. And King Asa, who was a very righteous king, one of the most righteous kings of Judah. If you're interested in knowing how righteous he is, just read chapter 14 of Chronicles 2, a very lengthy description about how wonderful he is. Vayas Asa Tov Hayashar. Beinei Hashem Elokav. Asa did everything which is right and proper in the eyes of God, and he removed foreign idols and bamot, and he destroyed foreign altars, and and he told the people to seek God, etc., etc. In two different accounts, Asa is criticized. One time he overextends himself to trying to employ the services of the king of Syria, of the king to assist him in some kind of internal battle. It should never happen again. But unfortunately, there was a problem with between the king of Yehuda and the king of Yisrael. May the Jewish people be able to live harmoniously together. Never should they ever be divided again into Judah and Israel. But there was a problem between King Asa and King Baasha, who was the king of Yisrael, the northern king. And he calls in the king of Aram. And he sends him special gifts and to assist him in this difficulty with the king of Israel. And God sends a message, a very strong message to Asa, telling him, and I quote, chapter 16, Chronicles 2, verse 7, Uba'et hahi b'chanani haroeh el Asa melech Yehuda. The prophet Hanani comes to Asa and tells him, Bihisha encha al melech Aram. You were relying only on the king of Aram? V'lo nish'anta al Hashem Elokecha. You see, the emphasis is he turns to the king of Aram. But the problematic aspect is not that he turned to the king of Aram, but v'lo nish'anta al Hashem Elokecha. He did not turn to God at all. And there's another story here about Asa. And just as a mnemonic, perhaps, to remember the story, the word Asa, Aleph Samach Aleph, in Aramaic, means a doctor. Asa, Aleph Samach Aleph, means a remedy, means a doctor. It's interesting that unfortunately at a certain point, Asa became ill. And it says, Vayecheleh, sentence 12 of chapter 16, Vayecheleh Asa was suffering from a certain ailment, and he had a certain kind of problem in his feet, Beraglav. Ad lemala cholyo, he had a very, very difficult ailment, very, very difficult illness. But v'gam b'cholyo, listen to this, v'gam b'cholyo lo darash et Hashem. And even when he was sick, he did not turn to God. Ki barofeim. He only turned, that's the way I would like to translate. He exclusively turned only to the doctors. So maybe the problem is not the Rofeim, not the Asa in the Asa, and that's why I think it's a play on his word, play on his name. That's the way I remember the story, that he's the one with the da. It's the fact that lo darash et Hashem. So we hope for a world where we'll all be able to understand that the central force and the focal point of our attention should be God. Baruch HaGever, as our Haftarah teaches, Baruch HaGever asher yiftach ba'Hashem, v'haya Hashem yiftacho. And even when we turn to people for assistance, we're entitled to do that, and that's part of human contact. And we talk to each other, and we assist each other, and God created people to help each other. That's one of the most basic teachings in Torah. We should never remove God. We should never violate the previous sentence that we read of Arur HaGever asher yiftach ba'adam v'sam basar zro'o and chas v'shalom umin Hashem yasur libo. Never to remove ourselves from an awareness of God in anything that we're doing, no matter who we're talking to, no matter who we're turning to, always to include God. And if we do that, Baruch HaGever, there will be this great blessing. Asher yiftach ba'Hashem, v'yah Hashem yiftach. Thank you so much for listening.